Miller, sitting here eating a bowl of pork hocks and beans. Phyllis Michelle Greenhouse. Good to see my mods here. Sharon Tuck, Stephanie. Good to see you guys. Twin Mom 2011. I see you from the, was it the premiere? Gnome de Plume. Gnome, okay. Thanks a lot for that. That's quite a stunning compliment. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I think today's live stream should be pretty interesting. It certainly means a lot to me what I'm going to be committing to you guys. So I hope you guys feel the same way. Timmy, as usual, now that I'm live, he was actually sleeping on my bed. Now it's like, okay, this is a chance for me. Timmy, do you want to come up? Hey? Timmy? Come. Oh, now that I'm responding to him, now it's reverse apology. Timmy, come. People want to see you. Okay. Batman, thanks very much for that. Good to see you. Yeah, it's Timmy live. So in case you guys aren't aware, we're going to be doing, I think we'll start off with Becker. We'll also look at Fight Club, and then I'm going to talk about The Funeral, if I've still got sort of my voice and if it's not too late. It's 2:00 in the morning here, so I can't guarantee it's going to be a very long live. I hope it's going to be 60 to 90 minutes. I don't know if it's going to be much longer than that. Jules Rules, hi from Northern Ireland. I must apologize to the folks in the UK and Europe. I know it is late. It's later than I wanted it to be. But the last video took longer to edit. I actually didn't quite finish the editing, which is why when I said something like, when you look at this photo, it actually refers to the photo of Brian's parents entering the home. That was the photo that was meant to be a reference. And I actually, that's a bit of an editing error. So Kitty Whitty, good for Sydney. I'd also like to talk about the Springbok game, but maybe leave that for the end. So I think we'll wait till we're at about 500 and then I'll get started. Something I want to comment on that I think's just very kind of an analogy from nature is, you know, right now it's spring where I am. It's getting quite warm, and there's a swallow's nest. I think it's the second or third season it's been there. And probably in the last 3-4 days, I've been hearing the swallows. Are you done, Timmy? I've been hearing the swallows inside. I actually don't know if it's swallows or swifts, but I've been hearing birds inside the nest and kind of making a weird wobbly sort of noise, but like constant. And I thought, wow, surely they can't be, you know, they can't have eggs and chicks and sort of brooding and all that kind of thing, you know, breeding and Lily Bell, good to see you here, also from South Africa. And what I actually think is going on is those birds have actually annexed that nest. And so what they've got to do is they've got to defend it. So because a lot of the swallows coming down through Africa are looking for homes, those that have found homes need to sort of occupy them, but also communicate that they're in them. And that's the other thing that I noticed in the garden. So standing in the garden, like, why have I not seen these swallows flying in and out the nest? I know they're in the nest, but, you know, why are they not exiting the nest? And sometimes when I open the door or they hear me in the garden, they would just fly out, but now not. And it just sort of made me think in a way about Gabby and Brian. So in this scenario with the swallows, if they don't defend the nest, if both of them don't occupy the nest and stay in the nest, then they stand to lose the nest. And I would also assume if one of the swallows of a pair leaves the nest and kind of says, look, this isn't really working out for me. The other one's kind of got to do the same, right? And it just made me think a little bit about Brian and Gabby. I thought you guys might find that quite interesting. Amy says, I can see Nick now. Tango Love, hello from Los Angeles. Good to see you. Sherry Long, hi from Northeast Georgia. Good to see you. How's the weather there? Chrissy Lee, what do you make of the FBI going back to the laundry home for personal items of Brian's to test DNA? Hard to say. Could it be, I'm not sure, are they looking for Gabby's DNA, or did they find possibly Brian's DNA on Gabby's remains or in that area? It's hard to say. Shirtlocker says, quite an analogy. I just think it's quite an interesting concept from the perspective of these little birds, that if the one abandons the nest, what's the other one going to do? Hey, Heather West, good to see you. I'm sorry it's so late. Okay, so we are at 500. I think I'm going to get going. I want to start this whole discussion on Brian Laundrie's psychology by just giving a little bit of background, just like so much background on Ernest Becker and on the book that I'm going to be referring to. And it's this book, The Birth and Death of Meaning. You can see it's really worn out. It's full of bookmarks as well. And you can see all the highlighting that's also been going on in there. So I'm really excited to be talking about this. I must also tell you that I wanted to talk about it earlier and I just couldn't find this reference. It's not as though the Petito case happened and then I stumbled upon this reference. I'd read it quite a long time ago, and when the Petito case happened, I thought, jeepers, that's something that was so, it resonated so much with me when I read it that it stayed with me for a long, long time. And although I knew exactly what the sort of context was and what the content, not the verbatim what the content was, but what it was angling at, I couldn't remember where I read it. And so I went through book after Ernest Becker and couldn't find it. And I was eventually going like page by page searching for it. And then the next book, page by page. And then I think it was yesterday. Recently I picked up this book and I just went through it. And on my way to page 171, I just came upon so many incredible insights that I'm still going to communicate, dealing with self-esteem, ego, and things like that. So in terms of this book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, Wikipedia describes it as getting its title from the concept of mankind progressing from simple-minded ape to a world of symbols and illusions, and then deconstructing those illusions through our own evolving intellect. Now, remember that word deconstructing, because that is what is kind of the theme of Fight Club, and we're going to be talking about that. Also, I did actually Google it. It was too, I couldn't actually find it that way either. I did Google it. Now, where was I? Okay, so the deconstructing is also something that you get a sense of from Gabby and Brian, in terms of their minimalist approach to life, in terms of their back to nature, in terms of the whole primitive approach, right? There's a deconstruction going on, right? We've built up the society, and certain of the things we've built need to be reversed. We've gone too far, right? So some of that is what is going on. And if you're sitting here kind of thinking, wow, this is cerebral, it's very indirect, it's very vague. What's it got to do with Brian? Well, we're about to hit on that. So let me just read this again. The Birth and Death of Meaning gets its title from the concept of mankind progressing from simple-minded ape to a world of symbols and illusions, and then deconstructing those illusions through our own evolving intellect. Now think about that, just that description of this book as a metaphor for what the whole summer epic was about. Mankind, this concept of mankind progressing, meaning Gabby progressing through her adventure, Brian supposed to progress with her, the couple supposed to grow in their love and affiliation and affection, and, you know, as people, growing together, growing as individuals, growing in their love, growing in their relationship, to a world of symbols and illusions. Now, what is symbols and illusions but social media? You know, what influence do you get? Well, how many likes you got, how many views you got, this, that, and the next thing. Bear in mind, when you are sitting at home and you're looking on Instagram, you're being sold a solution in terms of these content creators of this fairy tale life, of this day in that environment. That's kind of a postcard taken out of it, but it's a little bit taken out of context. It's curated. It is kind of handpicked and sort of polished. And that is sort of pretending to be, that is what we're doing. That's how clean and neat and nice everything is, and it's not. I just watched the beginning of the 60 Minutes Australia coverage of the Gabby Petito case, and sort of, to me, goes to that cliche. You know, it's a perfect fairy tale. They're beautiful. And I think it's a little bit overdone, talking about the $1 million smiles and so on. And then, of course, well, underneath all that was something else. It's a cliche you hear over and over again. They introduce a crime story as this perfect cliche, and then, oh, there were shadows and cracks and problems, right? And so this book is about this process of building up these symbols, investing in these illusions, and then deconstructing those illusions. How? Through the evolving intellect. And through the evolving intellect is possibly Brian Laundrie's role in this case, where Brian was becoming wise to what was happening with regards to Gabby in the world of social media versus his own position. And he may have felt it was untenable. Perhaps wanted to deconstruct all of that. He didn't want to build onto a project that he was going to eventually fall out of, you know, in his view, right? But it is essentially about becoming aware, in a way, of reality, but via the road of illusions. Now, again, that might sound very like, I'm not really what we're getting at. So I think I really need to read this page 131. I just want to see if there's something else to mention here. Just before I read it, I just want to mention this. Did you guys notice, did anyone know that Brian was no show at the funeral? So just think about that in a very basic way. Brian's a fugitive. He's charged with bank fraud, but he wasn't. He was a no-show at the funeral. Now, you might say, of course he wasn't, but that's kind of like a reverse psychology way of thinking about if he really loved her and if he was really innocent, wouldn't he have been at the funeral? The other side to it is, where is Brian? Where was he today? Was Brian thinking about the funeral? Was Brian watching the funeral? If he was, what was he thinking? Did he see Gabby's fathers? Did he listen to what they said? What did he think? What did he feel when he saw that? Did he wish he was there? Also, you know, how did his parents feel about it? But the other thing that I think is quite interesting is that Brian's parents don't seem to be looking for him. The media have staked out their home, so they know every time the Laundries come and go. And they haven't really been coming and going. They've been going on errands, not often, but they are not actually searching for Brian. Now, surely if they felt Brian's life was in danger, which it would be if he was in the swamps, also if his life was in danger because he was suffering from anxiety or he had some kind of, impulse, then there would be this desperate need to find him. And yet his parents aren't searching for him. What do you think that says? Stardust Muse says, let today be when John Walsh gets him. They know where he is, according to Michael Bonner. Brian will come out. Yes, Kate Garcia, that is what she said. We watched a murder in slow motion. That was quite a good quote. Environmentalist says, by boat you can easily leave Florida. Loretta Williams says, I think he planned it. So, have you read the 48 Laws of Man? No. Nick, where do you think Brian is? Well, I had considered, could Cassie know where he is? Could Cassie be helping him? Could another relative be helping him? Could he be at one of the properties that the laundries have that are passed through their oversight kind of thing? I think he may well be still in Florida, but it depends on what the timeline is. If enough time goes by, I think he would try to get out of Florida. I don't think he's hiking. I don't think he's camping. I think he's in a house in the suburbs somewhere, or a house in a sort of semi-rural setup, but I don't think he's sort of doing a triathlon across the wilderness kind of thing. I don't think that is happening. I did comment on a link that a outdoorsman said on Twitter. He said something about there's no way someone could survive out here for 2 weeks. And so I think it takes one to know, and it takes a survivalist, an outdoorsman who's got experience in that environment to know exactly what is possible. And he says the insects alone he couldn't handle unless he had the skin of an alligator. Helen Hawley says, hi guys, desperately trying to stay awake for this. Okay. Well, I hope I'm going to be able to make it worth your while. Barbara Warren definitely isn't roaming around in the swamp. I feel the same way. Okay, guys, so I'm going to refer to this now. I'm reading from Ernest Becker's The Birth and Death of Meaning, second edition, page 171. The pages preceding it are just full of highlights and so on, but I'm just going to read basically one page, perhaps half of the next page. This is something that resonated with me when I read it years ago, and I remembered it when the Petito case played out. So listen to this. Now remember what we're talking about, the psychology of the life of Brian, right? Now listen to this. Quoting from Ernest Becker's Life and Death of Meaning, page 171. Finally, among these benign forms of self-preservation, we would want to note aggression as a reaction to someone else's weakness. Let me say that again. Aggression as a reaction to someone else's weakness. One of the things that most people take with them out of their early experience is a dependency on others for their sense of self, a rooting in the powers of someone else. This gives them a certain serenity and ability to carry on daily without worrying or thinking about their own weakness and lack of confidence. This power dependency in most people causes them to rely on others, especially to cope with unusual or demanding situations. And if the other person shows himself to be weak, threatened, or otherwise insecure, then the person who depended on him feels threatened too. You see this most often when people are traveling together and are under the tension of an uncertain environment, a new language, new rules, new dangers, etc. They are almost wholly underneath their situation. And if their spouse or their friend on whom they rely for a sense of support and power fails to show the requisite strength or command, they will often lash out at him angrily. It is an attempt to rebalance themselves, to assert their own force upon being invaded by a sense of undermining and doom. Now remember those words. Remember the word undermining, because I'm going to be talking about it tomorrow. So whenever I read Becker, you often need to stop and almost spend a day absorbing sometimes just a single sentence. You need to sometimes reread a paragraph 3, 4, 5, 6 times for the full import of what he's saying to sort of wash over you, right? Now, what I find astonishing about this paragraph is I think it reveals not only the dynamic from Brian's side, but also from Gabby's side potentially, because it's not just a situation, I think, bear in mind they're both young people. He's not a lot older than her. He's not more mature than her. I'm not sure if he is more mature than she was. But I do think kind of a sense of dependency from both sides, a sense of weakness in a certain way from both sides. Both of them were suffering from anxiety. Midnight Dune says very much an imbalance between the two. Jawia says boys are slower. Yeah. Often, a young woman, a young girl, a young lady, teenager, they're a lot more mature than guys of either the same age or just slightly older. That they can be like almost 4, 5, sometimes 10 years. Their maturity just seems far, far beyond, right? I don't know whether social media makes that even worse with boys. I don't know whether it slows down the social prowess of girls. It's hard to say. But I'm going to read this part just again, just to emphasize. And what I want you to do is think about it from Gabby's perspective. Remember, she's also dependent, and she may also have lashed out at him. You must bear in mind, and I'm certainly not blaming Gabby, but you must bear in mind if Gabby hits Brian, she's upset about something. If Gabby hits Brian, she may be lashing out about something. She also said in the body cam footage that she was kind of in a bad mood because of the stress, because of the work, because of this environment that they're in. And there is a sense of danger about it. And the danger is really, well, what if it doesn't work? What if this project doesn't work? What if it fails? For Brian, it could be, what if my part in this project becomes like a joke? People start mocking me. People that know me say this and that about me. What if people start flirting with Gabby and Gabby responds? What if I start losing control of Gabby? What if Gabby gets drawn into this world and she becomes successful and confident, doesn't need me anymore, and all those sort of things? Some of it I think is real. Some of those feelings of threat I think are real, but I think some of those are neurosis, paranoia, insecurity, inadequacy, immaturity, all those things. Shelley Jenkins, I think he's watching everything his parents, okay. Caroline says the friend was going to meet at Yellowstone. Scott Tomlinson, she already was close to not needing him anymore just from growing on the trip. Yeah. Lawn chair detective, if Gabby was OCD like Shanann, and wanted her partner to jump when she needed. That probably annoyed Brian. I think she did some things that annoyed Brian, and Brian did things that annoyed her. I think she was annoyed with Brian on August 12th for apparently expressing that he didn't believe in her, that he didn't think she could do it. Life of Car says, do you think it was premeditated? No, I don't. I know a lot of people are saying there are symbols and there's this broad, there's all of these things that add up, but I mean that's I see it as someone being triggered. The thing that you might think of as premeditation, I think there was an escalation, things going on. So that was something that was going on for a long time. And so there was, to some extent, a predictable outcome, to some extent, an inevitable outcome. But I don't think that Brian kind of was lying in the van with Gabby next to him thinking of killing her in the future, like planning her. I don't think that's how it happened. I think it was kind of on impulse. Pauline says he was already worked up from the restaurant episode and from the Moab incident. You must bear in mind, he may have felt he got a lucky escape, but it's also a situation where the police were called because of something he did to Gabby. And he may have thought, wow, if I do something to Gabby again, then the police could call me and I might not get away with it, right? And maybe he did do something to her. And maybe he was scared that she would call the police. Maybe she said, if you do this to me again, I'll call the police. I do wonder what he said to his parents when he got home. I think that part he needed to rehearse his story. They embarrassed each other at the restaurant. She was codependent. Okay, so going back to Ernest Becker, one of the things that most people take with them out of their early experience is a dependency on others for their sense of self. Now think of those words. It's not just a dependency on someone, it's for your sense of self. Now think of a scenario in extremely overt terms and in extremely explicit sense, where your sense of self is being determined by someone else's social media and to some extent your social media. So I think what made it really overt was Gabby putting something on Instagram and then Brian putting something on Instagram. They're both in the same place. He put something up, she put something up. And so it is very difficult not to find yourself in a competition or starting to compare yourselves. And I think in a situation like that, Gabby getting more attention wasn't going to be good for Brian's fragile sense of ego. If Brian had gotten more attention, that probably would have been okay. But I don't think that is what happened. And I think that made him insecure and that made the tensions escalate. And that made him feel like, I need to control this. I don't like where this is going. But it's not just his social media sense of self that's being impinged. It's actually his sense of self. It's actually, he's identifying, because his identity hasn't really been properly created, because he's not a fully formed person, right? What is happening during the summer epic, the social media is either setting up his identity or it's kind of invalidating him. With Gabby watching, with the world watching, he's kind of being put on a pedestal and being, it's like someone shooting pea shooters at him. And it's like, well, I don't want to do this anymore. And so in a weird way, he's depending on Gabby for his sense of self in terms of their relationship. He's also depending on her social media for his sense of self, and he's not getting it. And then, in a weird way, Gabby's doing the same thing. Obviously, with a less fraught and imperiled sense of, well, it's the end of the world if someone doesn't like this photo of me. But in a sense, Gabby's also depending on Brian for her sense of self, but in terms of the social media, I think she sees it as a project, whether for him it's personal. Susan Becker says Brian had a big ego but insecure. I'm not sure if he had a huge ego. I just think anyone at that age wants to develop a bit of a sense of self, a bit of a sense of respect. And when you don't have a lot of friends, it's easy to feel insulted by the smallest thing. I don't know if that is necessarily a big ego. It might actually be a small ego, trying to be a big ego kind of thing. But ego and self-esteem are very important topics. And if you guys have enjoyed tonight, then I'll continue this in a series dealing with the psychology of the life of Brian. Let me just go back here. This power dependency in most people causes them to rely on others, especially to cope with unusual or demanding situations. Do you think they were in unusual or demanding situations? Do you think the van life was an unusual situation? Do you think van life was a demanding situation? You know, for a week, maybe not very demanding. For 2 weeks, getting there. For a month, definitely demanding. Reaching 2 months, the police have been called. Now we're arguing in restaurants. Now it's very, very demanding. And then it says, and if the other person shows himself to be weak, threatened, or otherwise insecure, then the person who depended on him feels threatened too. That is, I think, a definition for how Gabby felt during the Moab incident. If the other person shows himself to be weak, threatened, or otherwise insecure, I think about Brian saying to Gabby, you need to calm down, in the words of Taylor Swift. You need to walk it off. And I'm locking you out of the vehicle. Well, that is him being weak, threatened, and insecure. Like, you know, Gabby's in a bad mood. She's stressed because of the work that she's doing. And Brian, instead of helping her, supporting her, soothing her, encouraging her, kind of being there for her, is instead, I don't know, not believing her and feeling like, well, I don't want you to be doing the social media. Stop doing it. Let's go home, or I don't know, whatever you were saying. And so that then makes her feel threatened. So just think about these words. Brian feeling threatened leads to Gabby feeling threatened, just in a general sense. Stephanie says, watch the language, guys. Just be careful with what you're saying and how you say it. So now we go on. Again, this is page 171 of Ernest Becker's book, The Birth and Death of Meaning. He writes, quote, you see this most often when people are traveling together and are under the tension of an uncertain environment. That's exactly what was happening. They were traveling together. They were getting more and more tense in another's company. And it was an uncertain environment. One day is different from the next. In terms of, would they have enough money? Would they get enough support on social media? How would the social media environment react to them? Would it be a success? And in that respect, I want to talk about exactly what is going on here. The challenge we face as content creators is trying to achieve maximum individuality within the context of maximum community. That's also something I've found in another book of Ernest Becker. Maximum individuality, you want to stick out the most, but within a situation of maximum community, within the largest possible kind of audience. That's the goal of content creators. Becker calls this an unattainable paradox. I don't know if it's that unattainable in the social media sense, but it certainly is unattainable in the real world social sense. Becoming a maximum individual while within the context of maximum community, because community and individual are different, sort of cultures or different mindsets. You get a sense of that when you go to Asia, and you get the sense of the kind of Confucian mindset where it's definitely community. In the West, it's individual. But on social media, you can kind of have a sense of both. In a way, that's what's happening here. In a way, I'm the maximum individual and you guys are the community, in a way. I still think it's a bit uneven. You guys don't quite get a chance. I mean, I don't get to hear your voices because of the way chat is. John Walsh is so passionate, passive aggressive. The fugitive doctor was also innocent. Interesting point. Something else that I noticed in the fugitive was he dyes his hair. So he cuts his hair and then later on he dyes his hair. And I wonder whether Brian would dye his hair white, kind of like Eminem. What do you guys think? Jacqueline says Brian has a fragile, insecure personality. Stephanie says Brian made a lot of digs at Gabby in his post. I think that is definitely interesting. He had no hair, true, but he does have some hair. He could grow his hair, the little bit of hair he has, and dye it, or he could perhaps wear a wig or a hat. Patricia Burns says, I disagree with Becker about the paradox. Well, bear in mind this was written about 50 years ago. Things may have changed. So let me go on. He says, they are almost wholly underneath their situation. Think about Gabby and Brian. They are almost wholly, that's WHOLLY, completely under their situation. And if their spouse or their friend on whom they rely for a sense of support and power fails to show strength, they will often lash out at him angrily. And this often does happen on a trip, whether you are climbing Mount Everest or going on holiday. If you're with someone and they don't know the way, they don't know, perhaps you're driving and they don't know where they're going, you are relying on them for your sense of serenity, and they are like not sure what is going on. So what can happen in that situation is you feel threatened and then you lash out. And that is how it kind of comes about. It comes about through kind of this thing of dependency, being in a new situation, trying to rely on someone else, but that person ultimately being weak in the sense that they don't know where they are, they're not sure what is going on, right? I do think when you look at Brian, that he was, especially if you look at Brian during the Moab incident, if you think about Brian living with his parents, you think about Brian not having a job, you think about Brian potentially not money. There's so many areas of potential weakness with him. Also, this idea of Brian not having hair, did that make him resentful, bristling in a way, oversensitive, all those kind of things. And this is the part that's quite interesting. You might think that it's wrong in a situation like that to lash out. You're traveling with someone, you're relying on someone, they are weak in the situation, and you lash out. Oh, no, you shouldn't. You should just be quiet. It's right to lash out in that situation, because what is that lashing out doing? It's rebalancing the equation. It's rebalancing the power dynamic, which is basically saying, okay, I'm relying on you a lot. Can I rely on you? No, you can't handle this. Okay, I'm going to rely a bit more on myself. I'm going to get control back. We need to strengthen our position in terms of what we know on our handle on this thing. And so, if if I lash out and you don't say, okay, no, don't worry, it's fine, I'll sort it out. Okay, well, the power then shifts back to me. He says, quote, it's an attempt to rebalance themselves to assert their own force upon being invaded by a sense of undermining and doom. And so in a way, I wouldn't even say that Gabby came close to lashing out in terms of what she said to the police officer. She said something like he's a downer and he doesn't believe in her. But I do think there's a sense of rebalancing herself where she said, you know what, he doesn't believe in me. He's not helping. I'm really stressed and I've quit my job. And so what she's trying to do is she's talking about asserting her own force while being invaded by a sense of undermining and doom. Did you see that? The other thing is she kind of did, and I don't mean to accuse her, I don't mean to say she was wrong. I don't mean to say she shouldn't have done that. Simply that did happen. But I think one of the stories was that Brian locked her out of the vehicle, or tried to lock her out of the vehicle, and then she ran around the vehicle, and then she kind of fought him to get into the vehicle. And I don't want to sound like I'm accusing her, but she is fighting him to get into the vehicle, and probably with complete justification. And maybe you can't call that lashing out, but it is nevertheless, it ends off with Brian having kind of wounds. I think where she said she hit him on his face with her phone. And I'm not saying that he didn't deserve it or anything like that, simply that I think Gabby did lash out, and she was right to lash out. And why was she lashing out? Because she was needing to rebalance the situation. The problem was that Brian would probably become really unhinged and even angrier by what is going on, because his feeling is, I'm losing control. He wants control, whereas what Gabby wants is kind of something else. She wants reassurance. She wants support. She wants this project to work. Brian's kind of on an individual, taking a personal thing, whereas Gabby's trying to get their lives on the road, trying to get their project rolling. And Brian's not thinking like, well, I need to have a job, I need to have an income. Brian's thinking, well, how do I look? How does this make me look? It's kind of an immature thing. So we still 171. I'm now going down to the last paragraph. They're basically 3 long paragraphs. Quoting again from Ernest Becker, quote, a reverse variation of this same dynamics is when a person feels a surge of anger and extreme annoyance at another who is dependent on him. Right? Let me read that again. A reverse variation of the same dynamics is when a person feels a surge of anger and extreme annoyance at another person who is dependent. And now he gives an illustration of that. Now, I want you to think about whether it could be Gabby, who's extremely annoyed at being depended on, or Brian, who's extremely annoyed at being depended on, or perhaps both of them. And what could bring that about? Could it be lack of money? Is it being dependent on a sense of self, a sense of ego, a sense of self-esteem? But nevertheless, there's a surge of anger coming from somewhere. Or what is causing it? And so he says, quote, many of us routinely have an angry reaction. So what he's doing is he's normalizing this. He's saying all of us should feel this way. He says, many of us routinely have an angry reaction in the first instant when one of our loved ones gets injured while playing. It keeps us from getting off balance if we are suddenly burdened by a crisis. So think about that. Somebody gets hurt. Someone that you love, a child or whatever, gets hurt, and the first thing you feel is a rush of anger. Have you ever felt that way? Like your kid stubs her toe or trips, you're walking in a supermarket, just trips over her toe, or he stubs his knee on something, screams and the first feeling you get is anger, not shame or sympathy. It's kind of anger, and then something else happens. What's happening is you're activated, but you're also feeling burdened by a sense of crisis, right? So he goes on to say, a subtle form of this, listen to this, a subtle form of this would be our irritability when someone comes to us with a deep and forbidding secret, and they pleadingly take us aside to admit to us a great trouble or a serious disease. So he's saying someone may approach you, someone that you love, someone that you know, and say, and kind of impart to you this really deep secret, or that they've got a disease. And the immediate feeling you get is irritability. Why is that happening? Why is that your reaction? Right? Now, think about in Gabby's situation and Brian's situation, a feeling of irritability that may have been there all along. A feeling of irritability that is going through the entire summer epic. What do you think could be creating these feelings of irritation? Or what if something that is constantly a factor, something like, well, one of them doesn't have a job, or one of them's quit their job, or this project isn't going to work, and they just won't stop saying that. It's like, we're going in that direction, but I don't think we should be going in that direction. You keep going in that direction, but I don't think we should be going in that direction, right? It's going to annoy the crap out of you. If you're aware of someone's feelings of jealousy and so on, and you're doing the social media thing, that's also going to be an untenable situation. Every time you do something, you're going to have to deal with the aftermath, the fallout. You put a nice picture of yourself, all the boys said that. Now your boyfriend's got to respond. Are you engaged to me? You let this person say this. And then he says, quote, our hostile reaction to this would be an expression of our own inability to support the relay of such trouble on our shoulders, our feeling of weakness and undermining at the introduction of something that the balance of our meanings can't bear. Sorry. Often one has to steel himself to listen to a dire secret admission because it takes him off his secure footing. That's a really deep thing to analyze. I'm not going to do it. Just too much to go through. He goes on to say on page 172, since most of us do not understand why we would feel a surge of hostility at the approach of a helpless friend in need of avowing something to us, we chalk it up to the viciousness of human nature and feel self-reproach. So in other words, we feel bad that we have these feelings of hostility. We have a kind of a sense of guilt. And in a weird way, it's completely natural. But the point that is being brought up here is you are moving into an unknown, unknowable, unusual environment that you can't predict, that is scary, and someone is appearing helpless within that situation, right? Someone appears helpless in that situation, and that is making the other person angry. And so you can imagine that going both ways with Brian and Gabby, but especially with Brian. If you think of Gabby during the Moab incident, crying, she was crying throughout that thing, just wouldn't stop crying. If you think about Gabby saying how stressed she was, you can imagine how, almost if you multiply that over happening many times, lots of crying, lots of tears, and that Gabby appears weak. I mean, she's actually strong. She's working. She's pursuing a goal. She's trying to do something. She's believing in herself. But he may think that is weak. She's not doing very well on her social media, whatever it is. And then he feels a surge of hostility. I don't want to help you with this. I don't want to drive your vehicle. I don't want to be part of this. Your blog is crap. Your little blog, your little Instagram, nothing's happening. Hostility. And then it gets worse. It goes from hostility to anger. And so she feels undermined by all of this. She feels undermined by this, and then what happens when he feels undermined, and how does he feel undermined, right? So I'm not sure how far I should take this, but let me just go a little bit further. This is page 172. So far we have been talking about everyday aggressions, self-assertive behaviors that are in the interest of the organism and hence, at least basically, of life. But now let us look at the darker side of the picture, at what Fromm calls compensatory aggressions, and puts at the far end of the spectrum. These are reactions to severe deprivations of long standing. This guy's just so eloquent, he just writes so well. These are a reaction to severe deprivations of long standing, in other words, long-term deprivations, insufficiencies, to a severe cheating of life experience. Now think about Brian living at home. Brian living at home, he is not getting the full experience of being alive. He's not learning what it is to be a man. Thanks, Jordine North. Thanks a lot for that. Also, Gabby living at home with his parents is not quite the way it should be. You could also even argue, and probably this is unfair, but to say content creating isn't a real job. I'm just saying that you could argue that you're not getting a sense of real life through that. That's all. But anyway, he goes on to say, these are a reaction to severe deprivations of long standing. Another way of saying insecurities, fears, self-esteem issues, to a severe cheating of life experience, to a lack of basic fulfillment. Now think about if Brian doesn't have a job. Not having a job is like a lack of basic fulfillment. Not having his hair might be a self-esteem thing that gives him a sense of inadequacy. What can cause a lack of basic fulfillment? Well, what if your girlfriend is being drawn into these social media scenarios that is distracting her from you, making her aware of other kids and other comments and other people? And it's not going to be very fulfilling. It's going to feel quite unfulfilling if you have your identity tied to that. Bushwhacker says, thank you for this. You allow doors to be opened in minds. We don't do it enough. Well, it's really Ernest Becker is doing this. This is just something, when I read, it just blew my socks off a long time ago, and I've never forgotten it. If you've ever traveled, you may have had this experience yourself, where someone you're with shows weakness. They're not sure where they want to go. They're not sure what they want to do. They are tired or whatever it is, and it can make you really angry within a travel experience that's supposed to be good. And the same thing could happen to you. You may feel feelings of uncertainty. I was once traveling through France. I was actually in Paris, and I was traveling with this girl to the Sacré-Cœur quite late, and we were like halfway there, and I said, you know what, there's no way we're going to get there and find a hotel. And she was like, no, I want to go to the Sacré-Cœur. And I said, we are going to have to find somewhere to sleep right now. It's really late. In summer in Paris, the sun sets really, really late. And so it gives you a false sense of what the time is. And so we ended up sleeping actually under the Eiffel Tower. We slept kind of in the open, on the grass, in that sort of park area under the Eiffel Tower. But I got quite angry at one point just because she wasn't appreciating the fact that you can't be, well, I suppose you could wander around Paris right through the night. But I kind of got quite angry that she was taking that approach. It's a little bit of a silly comparison, but, travel's supposed to be fun, but it can actually cause strong feelings of anger where you think and the outcome of a random decision actually reflects your self-esteem, or your how can I put it? It reflects your strength of who you are as a person. And sometimes you can have a conflict with someone about a random thing, where it's like, well, I want to go this way, no, I want to go that way, and suddenly your entire identity is almost being challenged. And it shouldn't be, but why is it? So he goes on to say, they result in a truly crippled psyche, a genuinely deprived emotional development. For from they result typically in the necrophilic character, the one who values death over life, the mechanical over the pulsating. The most striking recent example of such a character was given us with artistic genius in the film Dr. Strangelove, in the magnificent scene at the end. I don't know if I should read this. Anyway, remember that Dr. Strangelove in his wheelchair began to recite his great solution for surviving the end of the world. The necrophile takes revenge on life for what it did to him. He allies with death over life. He's just talking about someone who's so crippled in their actual life that what they do is they make a decision in the end of death over life, not only in terms of, so if it's a criminal, they choose to kill rather than sort out the situation, and confront themselves and change themselves. They choose the shortcut of killing, but they choose the solution of death over life, because in a weird way, they've chosen to live in a way that's like death over life. In other words, someone who's not living in the real world, someone who is constantly criticizing, someone who is constantly running away from life, and someone like that can ultimately deprive someone else of their life. Why? Because they feel that their lives are fatally deprived of life. And somehow they get it into their minds that you are a threat to them and you're going to be depriving them of life in a way. That makes sense. There were a couple of super chats. I think I missed some. Kathy Lagrange, thanks for that. Martha Garcia, thank you for that. Trumpet blowing. And Zenaida Rivera, thanks very much. There's just so much more to go through here, but I see we at about the hour mark. Just see if there's something else I can just highlight quickly before I move on. So I'm just jumping into the middle of page 173. Becker writes, is he made to feel mean and small, low in self-esteem compared to those around him, especially to things around him? Was Brian made to feel mean and small? Well, think about how social media are treating him right now. Did he feel that someone else is making me feel mean and small? Did he make Gabby feel mean and small in terms of her project? Then he writes, is he routinely punished for dirtying a tablecloth, for spilling on the floor, for losing a sock? The message he gets is that he is less valuable than these things. Now think about this in terms of Gabby. Is she routinely punished for dirtying a tablecloth, for spilling on the floor, for losing a sock? I don't know what the answer is to that. I don't know whether Gabby was so OCD that she would kind of, lash out or get angry if he did something small like that, but it might make him feel worthless, less valuable than these things. That things are truer than subjectivity, that order takes priority over spontaneity. That sounds to me like a controlling person that puts order over spontaneity, that outsides and surfaces are more vital than insides and depths. Maybe that is how Brian felt, that insides and depths are more important than outsides and surfaces. think about that in terms of the context of social media. Yeah, Gabby was not fitting the definition of OCD, but she called herself OCD. I think most of us know what that means. He writes at the bottom of page 173, make it impossible or supremely difficult for him to reach out and warmly touch another human being or move confidently into another's body, relate to him so that he is always a psychological yard or two away from you, cannot touch you or be touched by you emotionally, penetrating with your own high level of anxiety about life, your fear of experience and newness, your lack of warm relaxedness, of comfortable playfulness, reward him for holding back, for self-control, for orderly arrangement, for taking care of his clothes and his gadgets, for skill in manipulating mechanical things, for not making technical mistakes in the use of figures and language. And he says, through all of this, you create a strange love. I'll just read this final part. He says, quote, you create a being who is so deprived, so walled up and pushed back on himself, so inept in reaching out, so short-circuited, whose nerve fibers are attracted to things hard, angular and cold, whose insides are such an empty echo chamber of denial that in order for this organism to sense in some massively clumsy way that would for him be a sense of vital expansion, to be physically healed and begin to walk, it would take nothing less than the destruction of the entire planet. Just think of those words. I'd love to talk about what he said there because it's like mind-blowing, but it would just take too long to kind of go through it. I think there's another thing that I highlighted here on this page. Here it is. And this is the last thing I'm going to read, and then we'll go on to Fight Club. This is page 167, and he writes, researchers have long understood that aggression was basically a reaction to frustration of the organism. Now, that is so obvious. It's so painfully plain, so logical, but it's something that we forget. What happens with a murder is someone got aggressive, more aggressive, and eventually fatally aggressive, lethally aggressive. But what is it at its base? What is it basically? It's aggression. But where does the aggression come from? Frustration. Where does the frustration come from? So let me read that again. Researchers have long understood that aggression was basically a reaction to frustration. So the question arises, what was Ryan so frustrated about? What was not like a little bit frustrated, extremely frustrated. And I think there you got to look at things like self-esteem being a big problem, not just a small problem. That his self-esteem is being chipped away more and more and more by this summer epic that they're on, and he to end because he's wanting this chipping away of himself to end. It's a symbolic threat to him. It's not real. It's not as though someone's actually sticking little knives into him. But on social media, it feels like that. It's not actual little knives that are going into his body like toothpicks. It's a feeling that is happening because it's happening symbolically, right? That can be something that's frustrating when you engage to someone. You feel like, wow, on a big enough canvas, I could actually lose my fiance because of that comment on social media, because of all those likes, because of that person, the number of followers, because of what is happening. Social media is destroying my marriage. Social media is stealing away my fiance. That's one way of thinking about it. The other one is, do you have a strong enough sense of self to be someone who someone should be engaged to? Do you know who you are? Are you someone worth being with? Are you someone worth being married to? And that may be a very horrible realization. You might think, wow, that's right, I'm not. But I don't really like that. I don't really, it might be true. I don't really like that that's true. I don't like you telling me that that's true either. Final quote at the bottom of page 167. Children often show aggression when they have been abruptly weaned in favor of a younger sibling. They no longer know what to do with themselves, how to relate to the mother, how to keep themselves in her world. And adults have always shown aggression in defense of themselves when their family, or their territory have been threatened. Their response is a natural reaction of the organism to keep itself in the world, a primal defense. So think about this idea of defending territory and this idea of leaving home, moving into the van. You move into the van, and so you abandoning your previous fortress, and now you're far from home, and now it's a sort of question of, well, what is my territory? I'm feeling kind of impinged this way and that way. Well, I want to retreat back into my fortress, but which is my fortress? Is the van my fortress? Or is the van her fortress? Is the van taking her away from me? Well, I want the van to take me back to my fortress, right? You follow. The aggression that we see in children is sometimes a matter of mere clumsiness. They simply don't know how to take hold of a fragile thing. Think about that in terms of Brian and Gabby. That is quite a childish guy, and the way that he tries to take control of Gabby is in a kind of a clumsy way. Think about the clumsiness of the Moab incident. He sort of smiles. He doesn't really show leadership. He just sort of goes along with it and lets the chips fall where they do. They simply don't know how to take hold of a fragile thing. Think of Gabby as the fragile thing. He doesn't know how to take hold of her. He doesn't know how to look after her. And so it's aggression by ineptitude. Think about it. He's 23 years old. It's aggression by ineptitude. He's 23 years old, so it's aggression by someone who's not got experience with the world, because he doesn't have a job. He doesn't have money. He doesn't have a life. And so when you don't have any of that, and the little bit that you do have, which is I had this relationship with this person, now I'm losing that. That is like losing your world. It feels like you've got everything, but you've actually got nothing. But when you feel like you've got everything, and on the other side of that is nothing, and you lose that, it does feel like the end of the world, and it is pretty horrible. Ineptitude is a very good descriptor. Thanks, Caroline. He had little to offer her. Now, funny enough, Stephanie, maybe it's not so funny. I'm not going to read any more from this for now. But funny enough, I had a relationship. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I had a relationship that was tested by going overseas. I went to the UK, and I'd say it didn't survive that test. I didn't survive that test. And at one point, after the relationship was over, and this relationship did mean a lot to me, it's probably the relationship that arguably has meant the most to me. So the stakes were pretty high. It was the love of your life kind of thing. And when it didn't work out, I remember saying to my grandmother this and that and whatever. And my own grandmother said to me, you had nothing to offer her, kind of meaning money, I think. And I kind of I responded with that with incredible, I obviously didn't scream at my grandmother, I didn't lash out at her, but inwardly I felt incredibly angry. I thought, I am your grandson, part of who you are gushes through my veins kind of thing. And you are telling me, my own flesh and blood is telling me, you've got nothing to offer this person. I'm thinking, do you have something to offer someone when you have money? But if you don't have money, you'd have nothing to offer them. And although I think, it's many years later now, although I think I had a point, I think there is also the point that you need to have a life, you need to have a job, you need to have resources, you need to have kind of proved yourself in a way, you need to have something going on to offer someone something, right? At the same time, I've got to tell you, a friend of mine married the love of his life, and I think he was still studying at university. She had a job. She paid for his university. So you could also argue, well, he had nothing to offer her. He's a student. I think he was living in her home. She was paying for everything and today the tables are totally turned. They are incredibly wealthy, beautiful children, very successful. She's a housewife. He has a job and he's got everything to offer her. So it might be a bit short-sighted to sort of say, you got nothing to offer me. Well, what? Must I offer you kind of cauldrons of gold? What about my personality? It's just a little bit difficult taking that into a real world situation like traveling, where it feels like, well, how much do you actually have to offer me? Practically we need to do this and do that. Can you help me? No. Well, what can you offer me? Well, I can offer you that I've got misgivings about what we're doing. Well, that's not very helpful. I can offer you doubts and be honest. Well, what did he have to offer? Well, you can stay with my parents. Okay, well, that's great. What else could he offer? I'm happily engaged to someone. I found the love of my life, and I read this on social media. Only to a point, and then it starts to feel a little bit hollow. When the minute you turn the camera off, you start arguing again. Oh, this is us. Look at me wearing my dark glasses, running on the beach. Today was a beautiful day. Turn the camera off, undermining. Just not real, right? I think the other question is he may have also been wondering what she had to offer him. I think in a certain sense, I think in a really big way, she really meant the world to him, but he may have felt the social media element constantly invalidating him. What's happening? What is that doing for him? He may have thought. A lot of people, and I know this is going to be, I know a lot of you won't want to agree with this, won't want to think about it, but I don't see narcissism from Brian as I don't see it as this big thing that a lot of you see it. And I'll tell you why. If Brian was a total narcissist, he would be totally a social media kind of, he'd be on social media all the time. It would be full of selfies. If you look at what he says when he posts and puts captions, it's something else that's going on. It's not narcissism. It's trying to establish himself as an expert, as a personality, as a presence, as a person. He's trying to be a person. And I actually think people have got it completely wrong. It's not that he's a narcissist in the sense of it's unhealthy narcissism. He thinks so much of himself. I think it's unhealthy in that he's got low self-esteem. It's like Chris Watts. He's not used to being a leader, being pushed into a situation. He's not used to the social game. He's insecure. He's got low self-esteem. He's got ego problems. His narcissism isn't strong or too much. And this is what a lot of people want to say. It's that, as Stephanie says, he thinks so little of himself. And because he thinks so little of himself, if Gabby criticizes him, it's the end of the world. It's terrible. It's undermined. But he can criticize Gabby. In fact, he needs to feel in control, to feel like he's got a point, to feel like his sense of self matters, because it only really matters in terms of her, whereas her sense of self is far beyond that. She's got a job, she's got this project going on, she's bought this car, she's got other friends to some extent. Not quite the same with him. Okay, so I hope you guys found that interesting. As you can see with this book, there's so many things to cite, and this is just one book. There are two other books that I've also just highlighted, all sorts of things. It really takes your thinking in a direction that you don't expect. It's almost like magic. It's really incredible. And there are many areas that he's so succinct about: self-esteem, ego, things like anxiety, all those kind of things. So, yeah. He was a chauffeur, yeah. Sophia says, oh my God, first I'm catching a live of yours. Sophia, if you've got a question, let me know. Okay, so we're going to go now to the funeral, and then we're going to go to Fight Club. I don't want to be on here for too long. I'm going to deal with the funeral briefly. So let's just do a very quick poll. And us to try and be a little bit, what's the word? Just be kind and considerate in your comments, especially through this phase of the live. Have you ever spoken at a funeral of a family member? Spoken, I don't mean just attended. Have you been called on to talk on behalf of a family member? If you have, put a 1. If you haven't, put a 2. Let's just get a sense of that. So the question is, have you ever spoken at a funeral of a family member? 1 yes, 2 no. So see, it's mostly no, mostly no. Couple of 1s. But mostly you haven't. So I can tell you that you are fortunate if you haven't been put in that position. It's not a nice position to be in. It's not a nice position to be grieving and shocked and unhappy and vulnerable and exposed. And now you must address a group of people about something so personal. It's not a nice position to be in. I've been in that position. When my mother died, I was 17 years old. My father asked me to speak at the funeral. He didn't speak at the funeral. I was the only one of our kind of inner family to do that. And I remember it very, very clearly. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I can also reflect today on what I said and what has happened. I can reflect on what, and what I said was heartfelt and what happened after that. I'm not going to share that. It is quite personal, but I'm saying that as a way to introduce what I'm going to say now, which may be a little bit sensitive and you might think is unkind. And what I mean is, I watched the speeches of Joe and Jim, and I was a little dismayed. And again, I'm saying that as someone who's been in that position, right? And it may also be unfair to say, because I'm a true crime creator and I deal with this a lot, to say, you know, you need to bring that into a funeral. You need to bring the fact that Gab into the funeral. You need to be indignant at the funeral. You need to, they may say no. That's absolutely not what we want to do, right? But to me, the wrong way to deal with anyone, and I include my mother's funeral with that, is to put a silver lining on everything, and then sort of at the funeral you put angel wings on somebody, and it's all cliches and it's all kind of fake and it's all aphorisms, empty aphorisms, right? Someone suggested watching both of them. Yeah, I do think they sort of balance out a little bit. But yeah, I don't know. It seemed quite matter of fact, some of it. I would have liked to have known more about Gabby, but maybe you could say, keep yourself out of this. This is the family, and that's private. I don't know. I don't know what you guys think. So, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, on WJXT, Lexi Ruiz, I'm not sure I'm saying it right. She worked at Gabby with Gabby at a cafe that Ruiz managed, and then she described her as always willing to help. She was just such a light. Anywhere she went, the room lit up. It's nice to see so many people come together and support her family. And this is the part that actually upset me, is that it said in this article, mourners were greeted with a placard bearing a poem titled Let It Be, that began with the line, "Do not grieve for me, for I am free." I don't know, that just kind of upset me, because it's like, let it be. It's not just somebody who died here, it's someone who was murdered. The person responsible may be on the run. The person who did it may be getting away with it. And you're saying let it be at this early point. Someone might say, give these people a break, they're mourning. You could make that argument, I suppose. You could make that argument that someone's emotionally compromised and they're allowed to mourn any way they want to. But I think the best way of addressing this is just ask yourself, if you were Gabby, if you were murdered, if you were lying in the earth, literally lying in the earth with earth on you, or able to hover above the ashes, that you had a body and now it's just ash, but you could sort of hover out of that, your spirit, whatever's left of you, would you also say, let it be? Or would you say, I'm not very happy that I was murdered. It wasn't a pleasant experience. It was a horrible moment. And this person did something horrible to me, and all that life I could have had is gone. Go and get that person. Tell my story. This is who I am. This is, I don't know. I found it. April Robertson, the author's name is Ernest Becker. Here is the book. Okay. Pulitzer Prize winner. I did put a link in the description. You can read a little bit about his pedigree and his portfolio. Gabby would not say let him be. She would say let me live, let me be. Yeah, that's true. So I think, and it's one of the messages of this channel of True Crime Rocket Science, is not to let emotion cloud your judgment, not to let sentiment cover reality. And I kind of include a funeral in that sense, where funeral's not an exception, where you need to acknowledge who a person really was, and don't project yourself into the funeral. Let's find out who this person was. Let's think about that person. This is their last chance to be acknowledged in a way. Let's think of them without putting pictures up on a wall. Let's talk about who this person really was in a way. The other side of it, I'm sure, is that they probably had quite a lot of discussions with law enforcement. They probably are all emptied out and hollowed out and tired of talking about certain things, and there's a weariness there, right? And I suppose that is also a factor. Just looking at what I said here, I don't know, do you guys agree that Gabby, and I say this also with sensitivity, do you think that Gabby is an example for all of us to live by? In terms of the, follow your dreams, certainly. But in terms of her situation, her anxiety, again, we've got to be sensitive about this because she was still very young. She was still building herself as a human being. She was still, all of that kind of thing going on. But I think what's kind of happening is she's being turned into something that she's not really. She's not being seen as a beautiful but flawed person, a beautiful but fragile person. She's been kind of turned into like a statue. And so it's like this hard, beautiful thing, but it's not, is it really a reflection of this softer, sweeter person? And again, you might say it's easy to be authentic in any other situation, but at a funeral, not so much, So I just think we must be careful in our compassion not to project. Projection is what happened at the Moab incident, and projection can happen like kind of at a funeral. We must be careful not to do that. Don't make Gabby into your own image. Let who she was speak for herself. And that is kind of going to be the work of this channel, is to try and let Gabby speak for herself, get to know Gabby, not what I think of Gabby or what you think of Gabby or what X or Y expert thinks of Gabby, but who was Gabby? What does she say about herself? I've seen it in a couple of comments, people saying the significance of the name of their channel, Nomadic Static, and I think that is such a great point. The fact that the name of this channel is kind of a contradiction. Nomadic, which is kind of like movement, and static, which is sort of like not moving. I don't know whether they mean it also like in the sense of static as in like noise, like radio static. So it's like they are broadcasting their nomadic journey, and what we are getting is the static, the social media static kind of thing. But it is quite an interesting way that they identify themselves, this idea of moving but being stuck. And I don't know, I don't think they meant to say this, but meant to imply this, but think about the reality of what has happened here. They moved, but they were stuck in something. They were stuck, you could say Brian was stuck on her in an unhealthy way. They were getting stuck in terms of their relationship. They were getting stuck in terms of this whole journey that was supposed to be fluid and full of youthful vigor and expansive and increasing and growing and evolving and, living, all of that flowing. There's a sense of it getting stuck. The whole Moab incident is getting where they stuck, and what the authorities decide is, you guys aren't going further together. You're going to be stuck here tonight, and you're going to be there, and you're going to be there. We're not, you can get back to each other, and also you're not going to communicate with each other. We're going to stick you there, and we're going to stick you there. Them getting stuck at the Tex-Mex restaurant. I do think her idealism and her creative sense of adventure is typical of youth, and that's also something all of us can learn from, no matter how old we are, is to have an idea and go for it. But I think there's also another lesson, and that is that you can have the flexibility to change your path, to change what you're doing. Even if it amounts to failing, even if it amounts to saying, okay, and I understand I definitely was there myself. And I know that feeling of impatience. I know that feeling of frustration where you're going for something and you've invested a lot and you can't afford to come back another day. You can't afford it. But of course, if you're not going to be alive, of course you can afford it. Of course, you're going to have another chance at life and maybe do something else. But let me give you an example out of my recent experience. I went on a holiday on the 7th of this month, so 20 days ago, about 3 weeks ago. I was actually due to come back today. I was meant to be away for about three weeks, right? So that was my plan. My plan was to go somewhere, and I did go. And my plan was to do certain things when I was there, and I did do them. But then the weather changed, and I just decided I'm going to cut my trip short. I'm not going to, because the weather was so bad, I was ending up working, but paying for the place I was staying at. So I was almost like paying to work, paying to stay somewhere and then just work there. And so I changed my own plan and I came back, right? Because the weather changed. And so I recognized something and I wasn't very happy. I wasn't very happy to come back. And, I came back just less than halfway through a holiday that I'd been looking forward to for a long time. Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks a lot for that. So I think we're going to move on to Fight Club, and then that's going to be it. Let's just get a show of hands here. How many of you have seen Fight Club or read the book? 1, yes, 2, no. How many of you have seen Fight Club or read the book? 1, yes, 2, no. So far, mostly ones, couple of twos. I'd say 2/3 ones. But a couple of twos. Okay. Well, I'm glad to see that there are quite a few of you that have seen Fight Club. So I want to just read this quickly before we go to Fight Club, and just look out for these words, deconstructing those illusions. This is the description of Becker's Birth and Death of Meaning. And a lot of these topics that seem very cerebral and sophisticated are dealt with in detail in that movie. So you might think, well, I don't know what you're talking about, all this psychology gobbledygook. Well, the psychology gobbledygook is in that movie, and that psychology gobbledygook was what Brian was gobbling up. Brian was reading Fight Club. Brian was sketching Fight Club. Brian was influenced by Fight Club, and so was Gabby. Bushwhacker says, you have to love Grizzly for her time and passion for this. She defined... Okay. Okay, yeah. It's not... it's a bit odd having other channels being super chatted, complimented, yeah, but fair enough. I just want to thank Stephanie. Thanks for that. Thanks for the moving live today, and also for your posts on Patreon, giving us a place to share and grieve. There's been a long season of sadness and uncertainty. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Thanks very much, Stephanie. I appreciate that. It's so true what Stephanie says. It's actually been a long season for all of us of sadness and uncertainty, right? And that, I think, is why this case resonates so much, is because there's so much sadness at the end of it, and there was so much uncertainty before it. And they were trying to do something heroic. They were going out with a dream in the middle of this depressing place that a lot of us found ourselves in. And she's trying to find a job. She's trying to find a way of making a living, of having a life, of being alive within all of this. And got almost 2 months into the whole adventure, into the whole project. And there's a sense of exhaustion of, as Stephanie says, a long season of sadness and uncertainty. And we are now, in a weird way, voyeurs in that journey. You know, it looks like, wow, you're at the sand dunes, that looks beautiful. Look how beautiful those arches are. Look at this, the wilderness. And then look at how it ends. And now Brian is running away. Batman, thanks a lot. Batman has just sort of referred to Stephanie there. I did see that. Thanks a lot. Motherboard, thanks for that. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly read again that definition of the birth and death of meaning, and we'll move on to Fight Club. Becker also wrote The Birth and Death of Meaning, which gets its title from the concept of mankind progressing from simple-minded ape to a world of symbols and illusions, and then deconstructing those illusions through our own evolving intellect. If you're not sure what that means, go and watch Fight Club. If you're not sure what that means, think about what the pandemic is doing to our world right now, where we built up all these things, these office towers, all of these systems and supply chains, and now a lot of that is being deconstructed. I bought a vehicle not that long ago, and when I bought it, the guy said to me, we're struggling. I said, are you selling a lot of vehicles? And he said, well, we're actually struggling to get vehicles because like steel isn't really being shipped as much, and cars aren't really being built as much because these supply lines are starting to shudder and shake, right? Our whole world is being shaken at its foundations. And so it's real and right to feel anxious, no matter whether you are 10 years old, 20 years old, 40 years old, 80 years old. No matter who you are, it's an anxious time. And this case really brings up this whole thing of the flame of youth flickering against the wind of the pandemic, the winds of change, and see what happens. And now Brian is running away, and truth and reality and accountability is running after him. Are they going to find him? Is he going to find himself? What's going to happen? What's going to happen at the end of this pandemic? What's going to happen with Brian? We don't know. Is reality going to catch up or not? How long is it going to take reality to catch up? So, Fight Club. Again, this is a very light glossing over of it. And by that, I just mean I basically went to Wikipedia and I just got some of the themes that are provided of Wikipedia by the filmmaker, not even by the author. So it's a very light glossing over. And you might not think so, but the text that I read earlier from Ernest Becker, the way that I handled it was also quite a light glossing over. You can get into a lot of depth and detail, especially when you take a sentence that he writes and you apply it to all the instances of where that occurs in the timeline and in where someone made a statement. And then this whole world, this whole psychological world kind of unfolds and unfolds and unfolds. So the source of this is the Wikipedia page for Fight Club. I'm going to start with a quote from David Fincher, who directed it. He said, "We are designed to be hunters and we're in a society of shopping. There's nothing to kill anymore. There's nothing to fight, nothing to overcome, nothing to explore. In that societal emasculation, this everyman, the narrator, is created." And so Brian is identifying with this everyman. Brian is identifying with this guy who has nothing going for him, and yet is fighting to be someone. He's fighting to find meaning in the world. And in a weird way, so are we in this world that has suddenly felt meaningless in the sense of the pandemic. Things are locked down. What is going on? Who's in charge? Who can we trust? What information is reliable? What's credible? And so what's happening right now is the emasculation of our world. I can imagine if you're quite a young person, realizing, wow, we're not that smart. If I'm talking about if you're like a 12-year-old or an 8-year-old seeing what is going on, these adults don't know what's going on. They just made a mistake there. They thought that was going to happen, then that happened. They didn't handle this very well. They can't decide what's true and what isn't, right? So all of this is happening on a massive scale right now. And before this, we were in a lot of trouble already. Before this, we were in a society of shopping. We were this Midas society, and then after that kind of got into the society of social media, where if enough people say the same thing, that's the truth. That's not the truth. That's social media, where you can be popular and things can go viral and you can have tribal things emerging, and none of it is helpful. It's simply like a machine. It's simply like a snake eating its own tail. Does it get you anywhere? And so if you think about what is meaningful, once upon a time, human beings were hunter-gatherers, and we knew what to do when we got up in the morning. And we now find ourselves in a world where there's nothing to kill anymore, there's nothing to fight, nothing to overcome, nothing to explore. Well, Gabby and Brian felt there might be something to explore, and then found that they were each other to fight. And then Brian perhaps felt, or somebody felt, Gabby needed to be killed. Why? What did Gabby think? What was her sin? What was so terrible that Gabby did that someone felt that they had to defend themselves by right? And now look at Brian's life. It is, what has he got to overcome now? What has he got to fight now? What has he got to explore now? Well, he's got a lot to overcome, that's for sure. Bushwhacker, are you a bushwhacker? You can't be a bushwhacker in the UK. Anyway, Bushwhacker says he either gets caught and thrives on the notoriety or something else. Okay. So just to get you guys back on the right page, Brian Laundrie and Gabby, so it's not just Brian, it's also Gabby. They not only photographed themselves reading Fight Club, the paperback, Brian also painstakingly drew several portraits of the characters. Brian doesn't have a huge amount of content on his Instagram, but I think there are at least 2 or 3 images that have got Fight Club in it. I think there are at least 3. And he even refers to the author directly, saying here, I've taken Chuck's book, Fight Club. I've taken Chuck's, and the fact that he's read not just one book, but then another one, that is the sign of someone who really is into an author. They've really taken it up. And I mean, look at the way I read Ernest Becker. I've gotten every book on him that I could find. I've probably got 6 or 7 of his books. So I am totally, absorbed by what he writes of late. Whereas Brian was that way with the author of Fight Club. He says, I've taken Chuck's books on 100-mile treks to the Appalachian Trail, which he abbreviates to AT, and there's nothing worse than losing my page. Think about that. If he loses his page, that's horrible. Think about what that says about the kind of guy Brian is, that he might get upset about fairly small things. And he doesn't want a generic mark, he wants something special. So Brian kind of has quite high standards as a creative person, trying to execute. I've just brought that up just to remind you that this isn't just my decision that let's focus on Fight Club. It's part of the fabric of the story. It's part of what Brian was reading over and over again. Gabby was reading. It's part of the fabric of the summer epic. So it's important that we understand it, because it's a way that we can look into their minds, right? And some of the psychology, which is quite sophisticated in Fight Club, we can figure it out through Ernest Becker. That's the way that we figure all of this out. So 62 weeks ago, maybe it's a little bit longer than that now, Brian sketched out a image of Tyler Darden with the words Fight Club on his Instagram. And he wrote this quote, which comes from the movie: "Only after disaster can we be resurrected. It's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything. Nothing is static. Everything is evolving. Everything is falling." Now think about that. Nothing is static. And that's the title of their channel. Nomadic Static. Nothing is static. Nomadic Static. Everything is evolving. Everything is falling apart. Well, I'm sure Brian was falling apart, and possibly even Gabby was falling apart on that trip. Possibly they were both falling apart. Possibly they were both evolving, but perhaps in different directions. Brian is certainly evolving in a totally different direction to Gabby right now. Brian is running figuratively, moving. Gabby isn't. Think about those words in the context of what has happened here. Only after disaster, and what happened to Gabby is a disaster. What happened to Gabby, what has happened is their whole project has ended. Everything has ended for them, for Brian as well. And then it's only after disaster can we be resurrected. Well, Gabby's not going to be resurrected in this story. Brian, I don't know, maybe in a way Brian can be resurrected in terms of his own sense of self, but within the very limited scale of his freedom, of his temporary freedom. But I do think in the context of crime, when a crime is committed, there is a sense of resurrection from the person doing it, that they regain control. They regain control of the narrative. They supersede the victim. They gain aegis. Is that the right pronunciation? Over the victim. They resurrect themselves out of a sense of social death. And that's what I think happened here. Social death is a factor. It's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything. And maybe in a very, very weird, perhaps sixth sense, Brian feels that he's free to do something. His Facebook is about freedom. He says something like, "I just want to be free." And I think if it's a legitimate final Facebook post, he says something about, "I just want to be free, and I apologize to my parents," or something like that, right? He's lost everything and now he's free. And one wonders whether, if the thought crossed Brian's mind, this is assuming Brian is responsible ultimately. I mean, legally, we don't know. But whether Fight Club was flicking a few switches during the heat of actions that took place. It's a scary thought. It's a scary thought that, because Fight Club is very violent, it's very physical. It's about physical fighting of people that you like and know, fighting yourself. It's about almost the glory. It's almost about, experiencing pain is a way of coming out of the numbness the insomnia of life, and that you should do that, and that it's almost fun, it's almost cool. Is Brian free to do anything? I don't know if that's true, but he may have felt immediately after the events in Wyoming, like immediately afterwards, there was a bit of freedom. He had a bit of money. He could decide how far they were driving and what was going on. He did have a bit of independence. But in a real sense, was that real freedom, real independence? Could he really go anywhere or do anything? What do you think? So just going on a bit further, there's another quote on July 14th, 2020, another drawing, another sketch from Fight Club from about 62 weeks ago. The things you used to own, now they own you. Now think about that again. You might say, stop talking about Fight Club. It's irrelevant. But Fight Club informed how Brian was thinking, and we're trying to figure out the psychological life of Brian, right? And I think about this quote, the things you used to own. Or didn't he own Gabby? In a weird way, he did by being engaged to her, by them being engaged. He had her. And he said something about, in that photo of them kind of being engaged, where they dressed quite smartly, where he said, I can't imagine I can't imagine losing you, and said something like, until death do us part. Well, looks like that's literal. But if you think about it, the things you used to own, Gabby, now they own you. Well, isn't he living under the shadow of Gabby? You might think he's free. Maybe he thought, well, now I'm rid of her. But he's not. He's running away from Gabby, right? People are looking for the killer of Gabby, or the user of Gabby's card, or both. The things you used to own, now they own you. Pretty fitting. That's the first comment to that. So true. So going on a bit further, and then there's on the 23rd of June, there's a photo of Gabby holding the book Fight Club at kind of I think it's Soap Creek. And you see Brian sort of halfway across the stream, the book sort of pointing his direction. So you can see it played a big role. They took it along with them. So this is the description in Wikipedia of the major theme in the book, in Fight Club, from different angles. So we start with Janet Maslin, who was reviewing for the New York Times. She praised the book. Not everybody did. She praised the film's direction and the editing, and she wrote that Fight Club carried a message of contemporary manhood. Think about that. Think about Brian, who's trying to figure out what contemporary manhood is. And within the context of the pandemic, it's quite a difficult question to answer. How can you be a man when you must stay at home? How can you be a man when you don't have a job, when you can't get a job because of the pandemic? How can you be a man when you don't have any friends? How can you be a man when you don't have social media that backs you up? I think maybe one of the answers is, and it's from a particular sexual orientation, clearly. I mean, this was quite an old film, but from the perspective of being, is it binary? One way to be a man is to have a woman. So put in another way, one way to be a person is to have a significant other, to have a partner, right? But anyway, Fight Club is kind of dealing with this question is, what is contemporary manhood? And bear in mind, this is quite an old film. I really think a lot of what is in Fight Club, if you had to make the movie now, might not work so well, especially with incels and mass shooters and things like that. there's a lot of controversy that Fight Club did lead to some antisocial behavior and some terrible things. There's some speculation about that. Especially if you watch Fight Club and you know the very last scene in that film and about Project Mayhem and all that kind of thing. And Janet Maslin wrote, at the time, the film could be misconstrued as an endorsement of violence and nihilism. What about the book? Has anyone here read the book? Because the film is a kind of they add a bit of a sense of humor to the narrative of the book. They change it, they streamline it. There's a lot of nihilism in the film. So what about the book? And is Brian, and you know, some of you guys pronounce it slightly differently, nihilism. Think about nihilism and the word annihilate. But there's one thing that is an absolute fact that you can't get away from is Fight Club is a very violent story. And we have an escalation of violence, of tension that becomes violence in this story, in their summer epic. You actually have them fighting one another, like literally hitting one another, this young man and young lady. And I just wonder whether reading the book, both of them reading the book, didn't make hitting seem normalized. I just wonder about that. Because there's a way that the movie almost makes it seem cool, normal, and almost a elixir, almost like something that makes you born again in a way. It brings you back into the world, but it's actually something different. Hitting someone is kind of, it's crossing a line, it's criminal. It's not, you know, when actual Fight Club started, people got injured, like badly. So going on, Fincher said Fight Club was a coming-of-age film like the 1967 film The Graduate, but for people in their 30s. Fincher described the narrator as an everyman. The character is identified in the scripts as Jack, but left unnamed in the film. And I think what's very important to say about Fight Club is that a lot of what determines the plot is the narrator. And I think what is happening with Brian is he's trying to narrate his life. Brian's trying to be the storyteller. You get a sense of that through some of his posts where he talks about the world and how he sees the world and how much a juniper tree needs and how much everybody else should need, how people should live their lives. And it's quite interesting that some of the people who saw him in Wyoming kind of, I think one described him as a generic dude. Someone described, sorry, someone described Brian as a generic dude. Well, that's like an everyman. But the everyman in this sense is trying to stick out in the world and does so in a very destructive way. And hasn't Brian done the same thing? Fincher outlined the narrator's background. Now listen to this. And this is what Brian's identifying with. Fincher outlined the narrator's background. He's tried to do everything he was taught to do, tried to fit into the world by becoming the thing he isn't. He cannot find happiness, so he travels on a path to enlightenment in which he must kill his parents, God, and teacher. By the start of the film, he has killed off, in inverted commas, his parents. With Tyler Durden, he kills his God by doing things they're not supposed to do. To complete the process of maturing, the narrator has to kill his teacher, Tyler Durden, which is in a weird way himself. You're not going to understand too much of this if you haven't watched the movie, but if you have watched the movie, it shows to what an extent killing is and killing the things that are closest to you and the most meaningful to you as a way of advancing up this level of enlightenment. Now think about that. If you've made this your Bible, how dangerous it potentially is. Do you see what we're talking about here? He cannot find happiness, so he travels on a path to enlightenment in which he must kill. That's from this description. Do you want me to read it again? He cannot find happiness, so he travels on a path to enlightenment in which he must kill. He's tried to do everything he was taught to do, try to fit into the world by becoming the thing he isn't. Well, think about the social media and that. Fincher described the narrator's immersion. It was just the idea of living in this fraudulent idea of happiness. Now think about you reading that and your partner's doing the social media thing. You're reading about this. It was just this idea of living in this fraudulent idea of happiness. And isn't Brian feeling like that's happening with him? He doesn't want to be there. This is a fraudulent social media, these polished photos. It's a fraudulent presentation of their happy trip, and it's not very happy. But then think about Brian during the Moab incident, and he's smiling and he's chuckling, and it's like duping delight. And I wouldn't call that a fraudulent idea of happiness, but certainly a fraudulent idea of kind of innocence, a fraudulent presentation of not being culpable, not being guilty, not in that case. I don't know if you guys know, they've actually found out now that the dispatcher did communicate that it was a male hitting a female. So there's no argument here that the cops on scene didn't know what was going on. Either they were told and they weren't listening, or they were told and they didn't pay attention, or somehow they were misled, somehow they were manipulated, or somehow they projected themselves into the situation. Probably a combination of those things. Brad Pitt, who acts in the movie in great performance, said, Fight Club is a metaphor for the need to push through the walls we put around ourselves and just go for it. So for the first time, we can experience the pain. I'm sure that is a good description of what is going on with Brian right now. I think he's pushing through walls. He's out of his comfort zone. I think he's just going for it. I mean, running away when the law is after you, where you're the most wanted man in America, is just going for it. And he goes on to say, for the first time we can experience the pain. Well, I'm sure he's experiencing a lot of pain. You may not think so. You may hate Brian. You may think of him as a narcissist or a monster or a psychopath, but I can tell you he is feeling pain. The love of his life is gone. He probably misses her. Maybe he's thinking about his feelings have changed so much in the last how many days. I wonder if he's cried about what has happened. Bushwhacker, wow. Humans are distracted from pain to focus on being happy, yet pain is in our instinct. No pain, no gain. Going on a little bit, Norton drew parallels between redemption in the film and redemption in The Graduate. I wonder whether Brian thinks there's a way to redemption for him. I would love to know how redemption fits into this for him. You know, is the fact that he's not at home, he's not with his parents, he's independent now in a way for the first time in his life, if he is. I mean, if someone is bringing him food and bringing him money, then I don't think he's independent. But if he's somehow out there outsmarting everyone, then I don't know if one would call it redemption, but maybe from his perspective, he might think he's redeeming what was his pathetic self, what was his everyman self, can one say he's an everyman now? Again, if you take this into the movie Fight Club, it starts with this really pathetic nobody played by, crap, I can't remember his name now. Who plays the one dude in Fight Club? It's Brad Pitt, and who's the other guy? Ed Norton. Yeah, sorry, a bit of a brain fart. It's 4:00 in the morning here. I've given live sometimes where it's so late and I'm so tired. People said, "Are you drunk?" No, tired. Okay, so I'm not going to take it too much further. I'm almost done. But think about redemption. Is there any redemption in the story? I don't know. Yeah, it is. Here is his name. So Edward Norton's, the way that he appreciated and understood the film, his role was, he said, he drew parallels between redemption in the film and redemption in The Graduate, indicating that the protagonists of both films find a middle ground between two divisions of self. That's so important. Is, again, you've got to watch the movie to know what you're talking about, but there's a kind of a schizophrenia in that film, spoiler warning, where his self does divide into two people, from being a pathetic guy to a kind of a split person who then emerges at the end of it, I think, a lot sicker than he originally was and a lot less innocent, but also a stronger person, a more assertive person. And that is a scary analogy for Brian in the story. Brian may not have chosen to express himself along those lines, but that is what has happened. That is what it's amounted to be. I just want to get this comment here. Is Fight Club about dissociated identity disorder? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that particular disorder, but it is very about disassociation, and it is about a confused identity. So I would cautiously say it looks that way. Environmentalist says you really need to understand climate doomism here. I think that could be a factor, and I think I don't know if I would. I don't like words like alarmism or doomism, but I certainly think that a lot of the fear of what is happening with our climate, I personally believe, is rational. I know there are a lot of people who don't. It's the same as the pandemic. I know there's nothing to worry about. Okay. But I can certainly imagine young people having different feelings of anxiety towards things that we have been living with for decades and still think is no big deal. And the issue here isn't what you think about these things, is what they thought about them. What impact and sense of peril and sense of end of the world and sense of all of these things. Just remember that the world Brian's living in isn't your world, and maybe not the real world. It's the world the way that he's seeing it. And that's the question we've got to ask ourselves, is what is he seeing? If you think about the pandemic and he's living at home and what's going on with the climate and what had just gone on in America, it's easy to understand someone being so anxious that their world is being deformed and is being, you see it in a certain way that is perhaps even quite accurate and very, very frightening, right? Thanks a lot, LM Lizzo. Thanks a lot. Yes, perception is reality. Rihanna, thanks a lot. Okay. I'm almost done. The last point here to make is and this is so fascinating, the exterior of Tyler Durden's house was built in Wilmington, California, while the interior was built on a sound stage at the studio's location. So just this location, just this house, You have the exterior over there and the interior somewhere else. And think about social media as doing something like that. I mean, in a weird way, I'm sitting where I am right here, and my exterior is being beamed to, at the moment, 927 people right now in this moment all over the world. But I'm right here, and my interior is right here, but my exterior is all over the place, right? That's just in terms of social media. Think about Gabby and Brian traveling, and they built their interior together. They've got their interior relationship. They got their interior dynamic. They've got who they are. And then what happens is that they kind of get torn apart or torn and pulled like strings in different directions because of social media. And it's totally different. Someone could insult me on social media and I'm not very happy, but I don't fall apart. But if I was 20 years old, who knows? You can go on a rant and whatever. I'm just saying, and it's even worse if you're in a relationship and someone is talking about somebody else or saying, what do you have to offer her, whatever kind of criticisms are going on. But in any event, you've got, in terms of this movie, the house is a metaphor for a person. And so in terms of just the movie, in terms of the set, the interior is built somewhere and the exterior is built somewhere else. And that house, the house that they live in, is such a psychological, such a wonderful psychological device to express the decay, the dysfunction, the leaking, deterioration of a person, and the house sort of illustrates that. The dirt, the grime, the way that house literally looks like it could just collapse at any second. It's kind of like, looks like timbers that are worn through, and that you could just sneeze and that house would just fall in on itself. And people can be that way as well. A person can be a house of cards. And so they purposefully gave the interior this decayed look. Why? To illustrate the deconstructed world of the characters. What is happening here is, in the movie Fight Club, and you might say, I don't know what it means to be deconstructed. What is it? Well, if you think about a house being built, it's built and now it's solid and it's new. Well, how do you deconstruct it? And how do you purposefully deconstruct it? You start tearing things out of that house. You tear out the carpets, you tear out the insulation, you pull out the plumbing, you tear out some of the wiring, you don't paint things, you allow things to crack and break down. That is the opposite. It's the opposite of construction. It's deconstruction, right? And so you can also purposefully do that with a person and say, you know what, I don't want to be on Facebook anymore. I'm deleting my Facebook. That's a deconstruction. I don't want to have things owning me. I don't want to be a shopper. I don't want to be a consumer. I want to live with my, I want to walk around bare feet, and I want to feel the earth under my feet, and I want to be in touch with the world, and I want to be alive. And I don't want to be a consumer. And I don't want to be like, have this commercial mind. I want to be like a nature's child. That's deconstructing. That's making your world in a way smaller. And purposefully, in a weird way, being antisocial, and in a way that is what they were. They would go out into the wilderness, they would eschew crowds, they would want to be alone. And there would be some encounters they would have with people that wouldn't go very well. The incident, I don't think Gabby or Brian communicated very well what was actually going on. And how well were they communicating with each other? I don't think in the Tex-Mex situation, that was a case of having a good communication. And I think, and you might laugh if you've seen the movie, I think Fight Club is an example of people that have become really, really bad at communicating with each other, so much so that the title character basically goes to all of these, what can you call them? Like what is Alcoholics Anonymous, that they go to these sort of counseling sessions pretending to be ill, because he says no one listens to you like people who are thinking you're going to die. Support groups, that's it. No one listens to you like people that think that you have this disease or that. And so in other words, in the ordinary world, people don't listen. Well, what exactly happened at the Moab incident? People weren't listening. Exactly. Stephanie says, Ashley Cartwright says, you ignored my last message. I have the image of him. Okay. Stephanie, I'm really not sure why you brought my attention to that comment. I mean, I didn't ignore it, but having seen it, not really sure what to make of that. Where are his friends? Oh, it would have been good if one of Gabby's friends could have spoken at the funeral. Veronica Taylor, anxiety is an internal alarm to alert you when you're going down the wrong road. Being alone with him gave her anxiety. Listen to yourself. I think it's quite difficult when everything is anxious, when every day is anxious, given the pandemic situation, to say, well, you making me anxious. I mean, everything's anxious. You know what I mean? 12-step groups. Gabby's friends were estranged. Batman says, I'll shop for anything I want. You can't take money. Yeah. But you got a very strong sense from Brian that he was very anti-commercialism. And that also comes through, by the way, in Fight Club, where I think he talks very early on about they're going to be naming stars and in the future. They're going to be naming stars and planets and what do you call it? Solar systems, I guess, after companies. And so you kind of get the sense of companies and corporations and capitalism has taken control of everything, and a person has been reduced to nothing, and a person has no agency, and a person is powerless and directionless, and he wants to resurrect himself, and so he wants to go to that by becoming a primitive again, and using primitive ways of the way that the primitive was alive was through violence. A primitive would go and gather. He would go and hunt, and that was his job. And although it's violent, it is in nature, and it is at least sustainable kind of thing. But it is once again a deconstructed way to live. It's not actually the way. You don't forget what you know. You don't forget your knowledge. You don't forget your technologies. You need to improve your control of them. That's what needs to happen. You need to improve your relationship with reality, and that is very bad with the world right now. Social media is actually making it worse. We don't know what reality is. Not enough of us know what reality is, and I think that's quite a good. Pauline Buckle says we are animals. I think that's quite a good point to end off on. That is kind of the role of this channel, True Crime Rocket Science, is to say, in terms of crimes and in terms of the people involved, the victims, the family members, the perpetrators, who are they really? Behind the mask, behind the appearances, who are they really? In their own words, but also behind their masks. Actions speak louder than words. What did they show themselves to be actually? What is reality in terms of this case? Can we see it? How good are we at seeing it? How good are we at discerning it? And then taking that ability to see into situations, to see into motives, intentions, actions, evidence into the room and say, this is what's actually happening in the world. This is what's happening in my life. This is what's happening in my neighborhood. This is what is happening, right? And part of your job as a person, when you come into the world, whether it's a person or an animal or an organism, your job is to find your place. Your job is to interpret your environment, interpret it, and find your place. And also, to some extent, for other organisms to find their places, and then everyone to know where you fit in this communal kind of, feeding frenzy, I guess, right? Just all happening at the same time. But the point of it is you need to go out into the world and you need to see it and you need to find your place, right? And we become very bad at that. We simply take someone else's word for our place, and a content creator, he's got so many followers, he's credible. There are YouTubers covering the Gabby Petito case that I have very little time for, that I don't think they are offering very much, but they're very, very popular. And there are also YouTubers that are not that well known that do a really good job. So which is reality? Well, you're going to have to figure that out. But I'm just saying the point of this channel is through true crime, and that is why I love Ernest Becker so much, is he allows us to access the criminal mind and bring it back to kind of anthropological studies and the culture of the culture that we find ourselves in, to figure out who we are and where we are. And it's within this timeless narrative that he wrote almost 50 years ago. It's so crisp. What he wrote is quite a long time ago, decades ago, still sounds incredibly crisp and fresh and potent today. I read some of this stuff and I'm like, wow, you can read it 20 times and it's incredibly filled with meaning and power in just a couple of words. And I find that as a writer, I find that incredibly I find it incredible, the power that he has with the written word, the power, insight that he has into the mind. So it's pretty incredible. Andy Arvell said, I read it. It was nice. Which book are you talking about? Pauline Buckles, stimulating. The best writers are prophetic. So I do think the final frontier isn't space or the earth or the oceans or the highest mountains. Actually, our psychology. We need to understand ourselves. We need to understand how we think. We need to understand human motivations. And they may seem straightforward. You might think, actually, it's quite a boring topic, or it's quite straightforward. But there's an aspect to it that is very complicated when you look at symbols and the things that we've built up. And it may be very complicated, and maybe half of it isn't even real. Maybe most of it isn't even real. And it's getting more and more complicated, but we need to understand ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to be consumed by it. And isn't that possibly what happened with Brian? Didn't he get consumed by all these symbols and stories? Did he get consumed by fiction? Did fiction overtake reality? Did anxiety make him susceptible to that? And again, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you're not sure how it actually works, how it plays out, it's like, okay, so intellectually I see what you're saying, but I don't really feel it. I don't really get a sense of what you're talking about. Go and watch Fight Club. You'll see how someone gets moved out of reality into something that's not reality, and they don't know it. How do you know that your real world isn't real? I mean, you're seeing it. So how's the penny gonna drop that the real world isn't real if you the one that's seeing it and perception is reality? Well, Fight Club kind of shows you this terrifying story of that actually taking place. And I wonder whether that didn't happen in the Gabby Petito story. Another Portland artist said you can relate this to a lot of society in the past. SSS said, did I miss it? Yes, you did. I'm going to be going off in about 5 minutes. I'm just going to deal with some of your comments. Patricia Burns, your books will be the go-to books in the future. We'll see. One of my favorite kind of obsessions is Vincent van Gogh, and I wonder whether I'm going to be like him in a way, unrecognized in my time. Vincent van Gogh didn't have social media, so maybe I don't have an excuse. Reality is individual. I think that's another way of saying it's subjective. Gina Stokes, finally caught you live. We are going to watch Fight Club again soon. Please do. Becky Rogers, this case is causing... I need a short break, okay. The poem Walter Mitty is closer to what Brian became. Fight Club made him out to be the hero. You know, Walter Mitty is also quite a good analogy for someone who gets caught up in daydreams and kind of fantasies of himself. It's someone who's kind of pathetic, who daydreams himself as someone much more capable. And that's that story. Southern California friend going into cooler weather now. How long can Brian realistically last in the wild? Well, if he is in the wild, it's a good question. It's not that cool in Florida. If a hurricane is heading that way, that could have an impact. That could have an impact. Again, I don't know whether he's outdoors. I don't know if I believe he's outdoors. Ashley Shelton, Vincent van Gogh, that's a really great inspiration. I don't know if you guys know this, but I thought I saw some Vincent van Gogh like images inside the van. I don't know if you guys saw it. The blue and the yellow and the, you know that famous picture he did with the sort of swirling stars and so on. It's that sort of effect. It's in the van. If I saw correctly, I thought I saw it. I've been wanting to talk about it. Anne-Marie News says, unfortunately, Nick, this is a truth for a lot of artists. It certainly is. Starry Night, that's the one. Can't type, enjoyed this one. Okay, guys, I see we had almost 2.5 hours, a lot longer than I thought I would do. I really thought I was going to just do kind of an hour or an hour and a half. But it's definitely been, I think I found it quite an interesting session. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Thanks very much for all the super chats. I'm rewinding. Mo, Maiden, you. Okay, great show, Fadicus. Give a thumbs up. Let's see if we can get to at least 800 thumbs ups. I think young people are more media savvy. Anne B says, thank you, brilliant analysis. Thanks very much. I'm going to try and do 2 episodes tomorrow. The one on what triggered Brian specifically, not like anxiety, specifically what triggered Brian. And then another episode also tomorrow, I'm going to start the process of the Moab incident. Every time I go there, I see, just even quickly, I see so much. So I'm going to be covering that systematically. And then a lot of you do seem to have gotten some value out of this. I will then continue with the psychological life of Brian. Jackie Blue, thanks very much. What decent person would be helping Brian if he's not outdoors? Well, a family member. And so I will be continuing with the psychological life of Brian, probably not every day because it just takes a lot, but maybe every third day or something. And so we're going to get to know Brian very well, because we're going to specifically focus on him. Susan, Becker, thanks very much. And then we'll move on to Gabby, the psychological life of Gabby. And I can tell you, when we have done both of those, we're going to know them really, really well. Fight Club is one way of poking to sort of get a sense of what you're talking about. Ernest Becker is another way that it gives us almost like a prism look into their psychologies, but again, just from a particular angle. We also need to get their own words, look at what they are saying on social media, some of their comments. How do I say that? Corgis and horses, thanks very much. Learning so much from you. That is my hope. My hope is, instead of just like gratuitously being, voyeurs in a true crime story, we learn something from it. We learn something about these people. We are touched, we moved, but we eventually translate that back to finding out about ourselves, finding out about our world, and making a society, being better people, translated across many people, makes for a better society, a more authentic society. And that's kind of what this channel is all about. Corgi's the dog. Okay. Yeah, I need to find out about Lullaby. I need to find out what is in that book and how that fits into everything. Knowledge is everything. Knowledge is also power. So Veronica's views, thanks for being you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Veronica. Okay, guys, we passed 2 hours 30. I'm not going to take it further. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank the mods. I want to thank you guys for the super chats, and then also all of you guys in chat. Thank you for being with me, all 800 of you and more, for the past 2.5 hours. Really been, I've certainly found it, it's this kind of stuff that I like to talk about. I find it quite fascinating. And I remembered this because it was something that I felt when I traveled. And so when this Gabby Petito case came up, I thought, wow, I need to find that. That's going to resonate with other people as well, and I think it has. Andy Mora, thank you very much. Patricia Burns, thank you. Hilly P, I'll check it out. Dana Nelson, did anyone else notice in the before and after pic of the van, clean versus a mess? Something about a map. Jean, thank you for being here. Sharon, you as well. I think Bria's probably gone to bed already. Okay, so guys, off. I've got to get some sleep. I'll see you guys again next time. Take care.